All right, everybody's in, and we would like to welcome Dr. Rodney Trice for his presentation on achieving equity in the K-5 classroom.
All right, I can take it away, right? All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It is indeed an honor and pleasure to be with you all. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen and let me know if everything comes up okay. All right. So, yeah, we're just going to dive in today. I wanted to talk a little bit about what brings me to this work, this idea of achieving equity in the K-5 classrooms. And I imagine, like many of you, when we look at our children, particularly at promise children, our students, those who are most disconnected from a positive learning experience, it's just tough to kind of see that brilliance kind of wasted in many ways, particularly when there are things that we have in our control, things that we can do to move them from a space where school is just this grind. You know, our work is a part of a long history of struggle. As you can see on the screen, we've been at this for a very long time. But our work today is probably more important than it's ever been. We can predict achievement with near 100% accuracy based on social and cultural factors such as race and family income. And that's just not right. These things have nothing to do with the intelligence of our children. So to be able to predict achievement with near 100% accuracy on these things is just um, is unfathomable. And we have a lot of work to do, heavy loads to lift in moving this equity work in schools so that our children can achieve and become all that we know that they can become. The central question is, how do we do it? Research has demonstrated over the years that equity approaches in the classroom have the capacity to close gaps. But Gloria Ladson Billings wrote an article, some years ago, maybe in the early to mid 90s, that talked about this. Yes, how do you do it? And in that article, she coined this term culturally responsive pedagogy as a method to close gaps and really position at promise students in a positive way in schools, looking at their assets as opposed to the pathology of students to push students forward. It's not a matter of skill. We have all the tools that we need. It's a matter of will and kind of what we bring to our schools and our classrooms, whether we can close gaps. But Ladson Billings also reminds us is that we have to model being before doing. And what she means by that is that we have all the skills, but if we don't have the right types of dispositions, the right types of mindsets to drive this work, our skills really don't matter. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about two frameworks that really position us in this state of being or correct state of being, which is a cultural responsiveness framework that was developed by Gloria Ladson Billings. And it's rooted in this idea that advances and honors the personhood of our students. And I also want to talk about this framework for instructional equity. That's where we actually get into the doing part of our work, where we're actually talking about teaching and learning. And so those are the two things that I hope to accomplish today. For each one of these frameworks, I'll be talking about specific strategies that will help us really achieve equity in K-5 classrooms. But I really see as our central challenge in schools this idea that we have unadapted learners and adapted learners in the same space, right? And these unadapted learners, they may show up in our doorsteps, in our schoolhouses, not really ready for what we have. School operates in a particular way. And then if you weren't trained up to pre-K and kindergarten to kind of adapt to the way schools are, you're probably going to struggle. These unadapted learners become dependent learners in schools. But at the same time, we have students who come to school, they're ready to rock and roll, and they typically are high flyers and become dependent learners. So equity work in school is about how do we interrupt this paradigm of unadapted learners becoming dependent learners and staying dependent learners throughout the duration of their academic career. And so our work is, like I said, really to interrupt this paradigm. Through the work that we do, how do we transform unadapted learners into independent learners? And that's where this idea of culture responsive pedagogy is most powerful. So just a little bit about what is this cultural responsiveness framework that really centers our state of being. It asks us to think about three things when we're thinking about teaching and learning in schools and in classrooms. One, that all students can achieve. This idea that academic achievement is at the core of our business. It's at the core of what we do as educators. So if we have a lot of different strategies going on and our kids aren't achieving, then we're not really doing culturally responsive work. Our kids at the very basis of this work must achieve. And the way we drive that is through allowing them to have and maintain their cultural identity, their cultural integrity. They need to be able to show up to our schools and classrooms in the fullness of who they are. And then we need to create space that allows students to understand and question the world around them through developing their critical consciousness. So this is the framework for our state of being that we'll look at. And I'm just going to talk about a few strategies. So let's take a look at our first domain, academic achievement. I want to talk briefly about this culture responsive approach called warm demanders. And this is a teacher disposition model that really frames how teachers show up in schools and classrooms, how educators show up in schools and classrooms. And it asks us to think about teacher disposition along two axis points. The x-axis, the continuum, is from professional distance to personal warmth. Professional distance meaning, not really interested in kind of developing and cultivating relationships with students. Personal warmth meaning, there's a lot of personal regard that I have or we have for individual students. That y-axis really speaks to academic uh, dispositions. At the bottom, you see there's academic leniency, where there's not a really big focus on having high standards. Where at the top, academic press that's what it's all about. We're going to press students, we're going to hold them accountable to the work that we do. And when you put these two together, a model really emerges that kind of speaks to how we show up as educators. And this is critically important, particularly for at-promise students, those who are most disconnected from a positive learning experience. So we can see for educators who might show up or their disposition might be in, let's say, the lower right quadrant, where there's professional distance and academic leniency. Like I said, there's no real focus on building relationship. There's low expectations for learners, and students view these types of educators as kind of cold and uncaring. And at the same time, you can see in the upper right, the disposition is centered on professional distance and academic press. Again, no focus on building trust or relationships, but there is a high demand. So students tend to look at these educators as enthusiastic about their content, but not necessarily warm. And in the lower left, that's personal warmth, where there is an explicit focus on building relationships, but not necessarily on academic press. And students tend to like these types of teachers that show up with this disposition. But I'm reminded of a quote by Dr. Geneva Gay, where she talks about it's not enough to love kids, you actually have to teach them. And so that kind of brings us to the upper left quadrant, where warm demanders kind of operate, where there's this explicit focus on building relationships, building trust, having high academic standards for our learners, particularly at promise students. And again, students view these um, teachers and educators as caring. What research tells us is that most at promise students, um, their education lands in the lower right quadrant, where there's just a lot of professional distance. There's, they don't really feel connected to their teachers. They're not really pushed in schools. But the research also says that if students have access to warm demanders year after year after year, achievement gaps begin to close and students begin to achieve. And we spend a lot of money on professional development about around building relationships. My experience, teachers know how to press academically. They know how to develop high standards for students. Um, but we also struggle with, particularly with those students who are disconnected, who perhaps aren't performing well. We struggle to build strong relationships with those students. So let's take a look at what personal warmth looks like. And I'm not going to read these to you. I just want you to kind of look at this chart, and perhaps keep in mind, um, or think about, a student, an at promise student, someone that you're not disconnected to, or you think about those at promise students in your school who don't have a lot of positive, warm relationships with adults. And just think about how transformative an experience could be, if um, we those students had access to warm demanders in their schools all day, all the time. So the idea of a warm demander, or this idea of promoting academic achievement, is critical. But so is this idea of allowing students to show up in the fullness of who they are, right? This idea of cultural integrity. And there are two culture responsive practices that I'd like to kind of speak to. You can see them on the screen. Positive self-talk. You heard Ruth talk about that earlier today. I want to talk about that a little bit from the student realm, through using a culture responsive lens, but also this idea of classrooms and schools kind of grounded in effort-based classrooms and schools. So I have this little formula that I'll use, that I'll share in a minute. But as you know, students who don't achieve, or they spend year after year after year, not earning good grades, the report card is never, something that they want to come home. It's not really anything to be proud of. Maybe they're in summer school or some type of intervention year after year after year. Um, their academic confidence, it wanes, and it almost becomes their identity in school. And there's this quote on the screen by one of my favorite authors, Dorothy West, who was a writer during the Harlem Renaissance, who talks about identity is not inherent. It is shaped by circumstance and sensitivity and resistance to self-pity. And so if we think about at promise students who don't really experience schooling in a positive way, and that lack of confidence becomes their identity, um, teachers have tremendous power to kind of reshape kind of what that looks like. Um, the circumstances of not performing well year after year after year, and you kind of see this as you matriculate through elementary, middle, and high school, how the circumstances begin to kind of shape one's identity. You often hear kids say, I'm not a good math student, or I'm not a good student, period. That's part of their identity. So there are strategies that we can use to begin to kind of reform or reshape that identity. And this formula kind of speaks to some of that work, or culture responsive strategies that kind of speak to that work. Through positive self-talk and effort, creating just a different reality around academic confidence. So let's take a look. So culture responsive self-talk is really grounded in really four steps. We ask students to kind of name their challenge. Like, yeah, like you have to be specific about kind of what it is that your what it is that's your challenge. It cannot be general. I'm not good at math. But in our classrooms and in our schools, we want to work with students so they are specific and can name their challenge. Maybe it's I'm not good at multiplying fractions. Okay, and now that we can name that challenge, that specific challenge in our schools and with our students, we have to demonstrate for them how they can have positive self-talk, right? And so, usually when there are challenges, like Ruth said, all these negative things kind of come to mind. And so we have to be specific about providing opportunity and space for kids to kind of think about themselves in positive and holistic ways. And this is just not about, listing a bunch of affirmations, but it's specific to the challenge. Like if I'm struggling with multiplying fractions, what is it that I'm good at? Maybe I'm good at kind of reading the directions. Maybe I'm good at asking for help, or maybe I'm good at just, continuing to try. But these are the types of things that students need to actually write on paper and remember themselves. The third step is really grounded in, positive action steps, like being clear about what are one or two things that you can do to kind of change this reality. And in partnership with, their teacher, those action steps need to be doable, achievable, and they need to be held accountable to those action steps. And you can do this a lot of times by asking students to look at the four steps, and that's really identifying who their peers and who their allies are that can help them kind of with this challenge. And that's a really kind of like inside trick as well for teachers who are helping at promise students kind of navigate their challenges, right? If a student names a friend or an ally that can help them with a challenge, that becomes an accountability partner. And that kind of speaks to this idea of building community in schools and in classrooms that help students achieve. Now, the idea of positive self-talk has kind of been around, a while. You could probably Google positive self-talk and, see lots of different, um, tools around positive self-talk. But most of them don't really use a culture responsive lens. They're just long lists of affirmations that are disconnected from academic achievement and often ignore just the power of community at promise students being connected to other students or a trusted adult and kind of transforming their experience. So this idea of positive self-talk is important, but you remember the formula. The idea of effort is also very much important. If you really think about it, effort is among the only things in classrooms and schools that kids have control of. They don't have control of when school starts. They don't have control of lessons. Sometimes they don't have control of where they sit. Um, you know, Effort is one of those things that they can control, right? And so, but we tend to build schools or the educational experience around all the things that kids cannot control. Um, what happens when we begin to build schools or build classrooms around what kids can control in their effort? And so I typically advise teachers or administrators when I'm working with them to look at these 5 effort-based norms and really to construct their whole experience around the idea of student effort. And there are 3 of these that I call my power norms, the 1, 3, and 5. Number 1 being kind of interrupting inequitable assumptions, the idea that aptitude should drive who gets the most rigorous and curriculum and innovative instruction, we have to interrupt that idea. What if we created schools where uh, the innovation went to not those who can, do well on an aptitude test or who have a history of doing well, but kids who are willing to try. They're willing to give maximum effort, and that's the ticket for, accessing those high level standards. Number three, organizing for effort is absolutely important because this recognizes that not only do we need to promote effort among students, we need to do work as educators to organize ourselves. Like our work needs to be worthy of students' efforts. So there's some aspects of kind of how we design lessons, how we set up our classrooms and schools, um, that evoke this idea of effort. And then the number five, this time for learning. I'll just read that one because I think this is one of the most powerful. At Promise, students get as much time for an expert instruction as they need to meet and exceed, high standards. This is very important. Two and four are important, but these are pretty much a part of our lingo in schools. Valuing sustained effort, creating high standards. We say and do that all the time. One, three, and five, not so much. Also around effort, it's good to have students kind of, rate themselves on how they do, either before a lesson or before a unit, and after a lesson, after a unit. I like to say in my classroom, you can only be in two spaces. You can be in the good effort and the excellent effort space. I don't want any, I gave some effort, a little effort. Like again, it's around creating these expectations around effort. But when you look at positive self-talk and you look at creating effort-based classrooms and schools to boost academic confidence, it goes a long way to creating and maintaining equity in the classrooms. So again, let's take a look at the third domain in the cultural responsiveness framework around critical consciousness. And critical consciousness is just a fancy term for allowing students to understand the world around them. And so for us, it's about not being afraid of teaching about injustice, prejudice, and discrimination. And this is critically important, particularly for at promise students, because they are the ones who typically experience injustice, prejudice, and discrimination in schools. And so if we teach about their kind of teach about that, they can bring a consciousness to that experience, and in partnerships with teachers, transform that experience. And I'm not going to go too deep into this, but Gloria Ladson Billings, who coined this, talks about if a school is about preparing students for active citizenship, what better citizenship tool than the ability to critically analyze society? Like that's kind of what we want from our students. Like in the end, we want them to be good citizens, and good citizens is being able to kind of critically analyze the world around them. And like I said, I'm not going to go too far into this, only to say that students need to be able to grapple with the big ideas, right? Why are there food deserts in communities? Why do I see signs that say Black Lives Matter? What is all this about? Why are Black and brown people dying at higher rates during the pandemic? And like these are big ideas that kids need to grapple with. And it doesn't need to be in the hot topic Tuesday section. It needs to be embedded and ingrained in all of our curricula blocks in school. Like to grapple with those big ideas. And then there are these things to consider. Like I said, I'm not going to read all of those, but like number one, that's very important to do, to include parents and community partners in this work. Number three, don't ignore issues of race. So when we think about critical consciousness and understanding the world around us, injustice, prejudice, and discrimination, race is a major factor in that. And we can't shy away teaching our kids about issues of race and racism. You can turn on the news every day and look at the consequences of not tackling issues of race while we have students in our care because we don't know how to talk about it as adults. And then number six, students need to be able to have opportunities to critique and dismantle inequities that exist in their space, right? In their schools or in their communities. The others are also important, but to me, those are critical. So I want to just give us an opportunity to kind of reflect. The cultural responsiveness framework, like I said, is put in place to set the stage for being. As Gloria Latson Billings said, you need to be before you do. And so just take a moment to kind of reflect on your notes or pressing thoughts that emerged. Or you can look at which domain is easiest for you to implement or most challenging. And we're going to take about 2 minutes to do it, and then we'll come back and continue our presentation. Okay, we have about 30 seconds. All right, let's come back to together. Um, we're going to switch gears a bit and kind of begin to close out the presentation, but I want to take just a few minutes to really focus in on the second framework, the framework for instructional equity. You'll remember the cultural responsiveness framework centers being. The framework for instructional equity is really how you put equity into action in the classroom. And you might recognize um, the core instruction framework embedded in this, the content, the interplay between content, student, and teachers. You may not recognize the legs that I have in there that interplay, that kind of gel with the interplay, and that's this idea of radical love, right? Radical love requires a commitment to dialogue and the capacity to take risks for the benefit of those we teach and ourselves. One of the risks we must take as pedagogues is to relinquish oppressive practices in the classroom, which students are treated in which students are treated like empty vessels. And this is particularly true for at promise kids. So let's unpack the first domain, content knowledge. And I want to share with you this concept of teaching and learning on the diagonal. So we would say, and I think we would agree for at promise students, we want to do all we can to increase or deepen their content knowledge while also increasing and deepening their habits of mind, right? But we know for at promise students, typically their education, the instruction they receive, the access to curriculum exists in this black box, I mean, this red box, where there's very little opportunity to think big or think about complex concepts, right? But if we want to interrupt achievement gaps in our schools and create more equitable classrooms and schools, we have to allow our students to go deeper. Our promise students need to be able to go deeper in the habits of mind or their habits of thinking that they have, but also grappling with deep content knowledge. What's really interesting for students of color, you can also map on this in this chart, the idea of racial identity development and building trust in schools. So we know for students of color, when you give them access to deep content knowledge or opportunities to grapple with it, and you give them opportunities to think creatively and problem solve, and they have a positive racial identity that's affirmed by the curricula, and there's trust being built by teachers, you get even deeper learning for students of color. But there's one thing to know, that all of this is driven by the types of tasks that we give kids. And I just want to quickly just go through a task with you. So this is a progression of thinking demand. And you kind of remember this idea of radical love is about taking risks for those that we teach, right? So if we think about taking risks and look at this chart, on the left, you see tasks that have a lower thinking demand. On the right, you see tasks that have a higher thinking demand. So the low thinking demand, it's about memorization. And in this, if we're talking about, multiplying fractions, memorization task might be, what's the rule for multiplying fractions? Then we also have procedures without connections, where kids will get, pages and pages of problems where they're just kind of asked to apply a rule, right? But if you get pages and pages and pages of problems that ask you to multiply fractions, even if you do it, even if they apply the rule, they still may not come away with understanding the conceptual foundation of what a fraction is, being a part of a whole. But in the higher thinking demand domains, procedures with connections and deep thinking, there's no way that students can come away with not having conceptual understanding of content. And in the case of procedures with connection, find 1/6 of 1/2 and use pattern blocks as you do it, and draw your answer and explain your solution. Like, you have to understand procedural knowledge to do that, and you have to understand the conceptual knowledge. The problem is that for at promise kids, we start with lower thinking demand tasks, and we hope that as we kind of work with them more and more and more, we can kind of graduate them to higher thinking demand tasks that have a higher thinking demand. And that's not really the case. Oftentimes, at promise students are kind of stuck in this space where they're not really thinking big, they're not really problem solving, they're not grappling with complex concepts. But that has to be turned on its head if we're going to create more equitable classrooms. And remember, is it radical love to give at promise students lower thinking demand tasks, and that's what shapes their education? Or is it radical love to say, we're going to give you access to the highest level content, and we're going to provide the support you need to access that content, and we're going to do whatever we need to do to make that happen? I would say that at promise students perhaps need to spend, I don't know, 60 to 75% of their time grappling with high thinking demand tasks. That's radical love. Let's look at our last two domains in the framework for instructional equity, the interplay between teacher and student. And I want to talk about the strategy around accountable talk. You remember that radical love in the definition, it said that it's about dialogue and taking risks. Well, accountable talk is all about dialogue. It's a structure for classroom dialogue where kids are engaged in high level talk for a long period of time. Um, and they're grappling with big ideas. And you can see on the left, there are commitments for kids. For instance, kids need to be engaged with learning through talk. There needs to be accountability to the learning community, accountability to high level knowledge or core knowledge. There needs to be accountability to rigorous thinking. These are things that kids need to commit to. And they'll do it because they're talking to themselves through positive self talk. And they've committed to an effort based classroom because the teacher has set that up in advance. And so these are things that kids can commit to. On the right, you see accountable talk teacher moves. And these are moves that really advance rigor, that advance students' capacity to think deeper. And what I want to do is really show, instead of talking about this, I want to show you a video of kind of how this plays out in school. So the video that you're going to watch is about 5 minutes long, and it'll kind of close out our session for today. But it's a fourth grade math lesson. And I want you to look for these 6 things and the things that we're already talked to, the things that students are accountable to, the learning community, knowledge, rigorous thinking. And I want you to look for the moves that the teacher puts in place. And then I want you to kind of perhaps, grade the lesson. Is it a lesson that is of high thinking demand or low thinking demand? Do you see evidence of radical love? So let's take a look at this video.
A variable is like an algebraic expression.
Very good.
This is letter and has letter.
Very good. Anyone have anything to build on that with any extra comments? Okay, Chris Landy.
I like to build on Gaia points. Variable does have letter and also it doesn't have equal signs.
Very good. Well, a variable is just the letter. You might be talking about, what's she trying to say? Does anyone have any idea what she's trying to say? Or do you want to fix it really quickly? If not, you can choose somebody to help you develop your thought.
I think what she's talking about is an expression.
Say more, please.
An expression doesn't use an equal sign.
Very good. Very good. Another thought, Deshauna?
I'd like to add on to Jacob's point. It doesn't use an equal sign. It uses parentheses.
Okay. Especially if it has...
Two operations.
Especially if it has what?
Two operations.
Two operations. So you guys already are coming in here with a lot of knowledge. Essence, you have one final point?
I would like to add on to Gael's point when she said use letters. It's called the algebraic expression.
Excellent. Turn your machine so that A equals 0. Turn your machine so that A equals 0. All right, everybody there?
Yes.
Okay. Now, it says, what is the value of your last name? If, let's do my name, for example. I'm doing this with you guys, and I'm writing B equals O equals W equals L equals E equals and S equals.
And then you add it all up.
Aha, okay. And then what do you do, Essence?
You add it all up.
Your idea now? Okay, go for it. Arthur?
A1 but the letters 6.
6 letters. Chris Landy?
10.
And you know the sum yet?
Yes. 75.
And Jeremiah?
8.
8. What'd you ask her, Arthur? What'd you ask her?
How much? I asked her how much how does she have less letters? She has more letters than me, but less but less numbers.
Okay,
Less than.
that is actually exactly what I was about to point out. Jeremiah has 8 letters and his sum is 74. Chris Landy has 10 letters and her sum is 75, just one greater than Jeremiah's. Arthur has 6 letters and his sum is 81. Gael has 6 letters and her sum is 36. Deshauna, 9 letters and 87. Essence, 7 and 56. And Jacob, 5 and 26. I want to hear your conversation right now about some things that you noticed. And Arthur started us off greatly. What is your response to his question?
Well, I guess the greater the letter, the less the number. Or
I want you to say a comment that you're confident about. You guess, you think, or what?
well, actually, I guess it's just the number of the variable that when you put it and then you add it all together, it's just what it creates. And some letters have more variables than the other. Some variables have bigger numbers than others.
Okay. Deshauna?
I would just want to say, like, I have like 3 A's in my names and the A stand for 0, and I still got way more than Cassandra, and she only have like, I don't know how many A's, like 1 or 2.
Excellent observation. So Deshauna says that her name has 3 A's. Everybody following me so far? Mm-hmm. Okay. Her name has 3 A's. So automatically that equals
0.
But she still has, what's your sum, Deshauna?
87.
What does that say about the rest of Deshauna's name? The letters and their variables.
The rest of the letters in her name has higher variables.
Okay. Who wants to build onto that? Anybody?
I think it is because Deshauna has mostly letters that are at the end of the alphabet.
Cosigns all around?
All right. I hope you could see evidence of radical love in that video there, where students were held to a high thinking demand, grappling with complex issues. And it's my hope that going through these 2 frameworks with you gave you some idea on how to achieve equitable environments in classrooms, and that there are some takeaways that you could use in your space. But again, I want to thank you for your time and allowing me to be with you this morning. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.